Every year without fail, a group of us old high school friends reunite for our annual camping trip. It's something we've done ever since we graduated and went our separate ways. The tradition started as a simple getaway from the hustle of adult life, a chance to reconnect and enjoy a few days of peace in the wilderness. But over the years, it became something more ritual that none of us dared to break. The spot we always went to was tucked away in a remote part of a forest. It wasn't marked on most maps, and that's exactly why we loved it. Isolated, untouched, and silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. No cell signal, no other campers. Just us, nature, and the memories we'd been carrying for years. This year felt different from the moment we arrived. The air was heavier somehow, the sky darker, the trees more ominous than usual. Maybe it was the stress of life that weighed on us, long hours at work, personal issues, or just the passage of time, but something about this trip didn't sit right with me. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching us. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep red glow through the treetops as the temperature dropped. We huddled around the fire, letting its warmth fight back the creeping chill. The fire crackled and hissed as we tossed in more logs, its flames flickering wildly in the brisk autumn wind. We passed around a bottle of whiskey, the familiar ritual easing the tension that had been building since our arrival. As night settled in, the fire became our only source of light. The darkness outside our small circle was absolute, impenetrable. The stars, usually bright out here in the wilderness, were hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to smother the sky. The conversation turned, as it always did, to ghost stories. We had told the same ones for years, but each time, we tried to add a new twist or a detail that would make it even scarier than before. I had been saving a particular story for this trip, one that I had heard from an old-timer who used to live near these woods. It wasn't your typical campfire tale, but I knew it would get under their skin. The fire crackled as I leaned forward, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across my friends' faces. The mood had already grown tense, and I hadn't even started yet. "There's an old legend about these woods," I began, my voice low and deliberate. "Not one you hear in the usual campfire stories. It's about a man, a hunter, they say, who lived out here by himself many years ago. He knew these woods better than anyone, spent his whole life in them. But one day, he wandered too far, went deeper into the forest than he ever had before. And he never came back." My friends shifted uneasily in their seats, the glow of the fire reflecting in their wide eyes. They were hooked. Now, some say he got lost, that he fell down a ravine or got mauled by a bear. But the locals, the ones who grew up around here, they tell a different story. They say he didn't die. Not really. They say he's still out there, wandering the woods, lost between worlds, not quite human anymore. People call him the Wanderer. They say if you're unlucky enough, you might catch a glimpse of him hunched over, walking with a limp, his body twisted from years of isolation. And if you do see him, you're supposed to run. Run and never look back. I paused for effect, letting the weight of the story sink in. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan around us. Even the fire seemed to burn a little dimmer, as if the woods themselves were reacting to the story. "The thing is," I added, staring directly at Rossi, "it's said that the Wanderer is seen most often in this exact area." Rossi, who had been leaning back, shot up straight. Her face was pale in the firelight, and her usual sarcastic grin was gone. "That's not funny," she said, her voice shaky. "You know this is where people have gone missing, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "Come on, Rossi, it's just a story." But she wasn't laughing. She turned to the others, her eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. "My granddad used to talk about something like that. He called it the shadow of the forest. He said it wasn't just a story. He swore he saw it once, years ago, and he was never the same after that. He wouldn't even come near these woods." I looked around at the others. Adam, usually the loudest of the group, was silent, staring into the fire as if it held answers to some question he didn't want to ask. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest, the insects, the occasional bird call, had gone silent too. And an easy stillness had settled over everything, as if the forest itself was listening. And then we saw it, a faint light, deep in the woods, flickering between the trees like the flame of a distant torch. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight, and the way it moved jerky and natural sent a shiver down my spine. "What the hell is that?" Adam whispered, squinting into the darkness. "No one's supposed to be out here," I said, my voice barely audible. "We're miles from any trail." The light grew closer, bobbing up and down as it weaved through the trees. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Just that eerie glow, moving steadily toward us. We need to put out the fire, Rosie said, her voice urgent. Now, we scrambled to smother the flames, kicking dirt over the fire until the light disappeared, and we were plunged into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as the silence closed in around us. We crouched low, our eyes fixed on the approaching light. It disappeared behind a thicket of trees, and we took the opportunity to move quietly toward the ridge above our campsite. We moved in complete silence, our breaths shallow and rapid, every twig snap and leaf crunch echoing in the stillness. As we reached the top of the ridge, we lay flat on the ground, peeking over the edge to get a better look at whatever or whoever was down there. And that's when we saw him. A figure, hunched and shuffling, emerged from the trees, holding a flickering torch or lantern in one gnarled hand. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if his body was struggling to obey his mind. Even from this distance, something about him was deeply unsettling. He moved closer to where our fire had been, circling the ashes as if he was searching for something. His head jerked from side to side in sharp and natural motions, and when he turned in our direction, the firelight illuminated his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his eyes hollowed and sunken deep into his head. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, exposing yellow teeth that seemed too sharp for a human. Rosie let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as her eyes widened in terror. The creature below us stopped, frozen in place, and then slowly tilted its head upward, staring directly at us. We stayed as still as we could, barely daring to breathe. The thing's glowing eyes locked onto ours, and blinking and unfeeling. And then it started moving toward the base of the ridge. We didn't need to be told twice. Without a word, we bolted back through the forest, branches scratching at our arms and faces as we ran. My lungs burned, and my heart raced, but I didn't dare stop. The footsteps behind us grew louder, faster, until they were almost right on top of us. We broke through the trees and into a clearing, our legs barely able to carry us any further. The footsteps stopped. Panting, I turned around, expecting to see the creature emerging from the tree line. But there was nothing. We stood there, breathless and shaking, waiting for anything to move. But the forest was silent again. We need to get out of here, Adam said, his voice trembling. Now we made our way back to the campsite as quickly as we could, throwing our gear into our backpacks and tearing down the tents in record time. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig made my heart skip a beat. Just as we were about to leave, I glanced back toward the ridge, and there it was again, the flickering light, bobbing slowly through the trees. But this time, it wasn't alone. 3 more figures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on us, their twisted bodies moving in perfect unison. They stood there, watching, waiting, as if daring us to stay. We didn't need any more convincing. We ran for the car and drove out of there as fast as we could, the eerie glow of the figures fading in the distance behind us. As we sped down the dirt road, the silence in the car was suffocating. No one spoke. No one needed to. We all knew what we had seen. And none of us would ever be able to forget it. To this day, I don't know what those things were. Maybe they were the Wanderer, or maybe something older, something darker, that had been waiting in those woods long before we ever arrived. All I know is that I will never go back, and neither will any of my friends. The decision to return to the camp had been weighing on my mind for years, a strange compulsion I could never shake. It was the same camp I used to visit every summer as a kid, the place where I'd made my best childhood memories. It was also the place where my best friend disappeared, never to be seen again. We were inseparable back then, my friend and I, the kind of friendship that made you feel like nothing in the world could ever break your bond. We'd meet up at camp each summer, play until dusk, and tell ghost stories by the fire, scaring ourselves silly. Then, one summer, my friend just vanished, no trace, no explanation. The camp staff searched for days, the police were called, but nothing. He was swallowed up by the woods, and I never saw him again. The camp shut down after that. Too much bad press, I guess, and the place became one of those abandoned summer camps you hear about in horror stories. For years, I avoided thinking about it. But something kept pulling me back, an uneasy curiosity, a need to face whatever I had left behind. And so, I decided, against all rational judgment, to visit it again. I drove up to the place just before dusk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the empty cabins and rusted-out playground. The camp hadn't aged well. Most of the buildings were overgrown with ivy, the once clear paths now nothing more than narrow trails through dense underbrush. The woods seemed thicker than I remembered, more claustrophobic, as if the trees had crept closer over the years. I parked the car in the same gravel lot we used as kids and grabbed my backpack. Inside was everything I thought I'd need for one night: a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a couple of snacks. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a night, maybe less, to see if I could shake the feeling that had been gnawing at me for years. Setting up camp near the same spot we used to pitch our tent felt surreal, as if I were stepping back in time. I could almost hear the echoes of our laughter, the splash of water from the nearby lake where we used to swim. The quiet around me was eerie, the kind of silence that makes you strain your ears, listening for something that should be there but isn't. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of wind through the trees. As the sun sank below the horizon, a chill settled in. I huddled in front of a small campfire I'd managed to build, staring into the flames. Memories of my lost friend swirled in my head. The last night I saw him was burned into my mind. We had stayed up late, way past the camp's curfew, talking about what we wanted to do when we grew up. I remember he seemed restless, like something was bothering him, but he wouldn't say what. And then, the next morning, he was gone. A shiver ran down my spine, but I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. The fire flickered and sputtered in the wind. I was getting ready to crawl into my tent and sleep when I heard something. A voice. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. It sounded like him, my friend. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice called my name, soft and distant, coming from the direction of the woods. My rational mind screamed that it couldn't be him, that it had been years since his disappearance, and that there was no way he could be out there now. But the voice, it was unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from the fire, peering into the trees. The light barely penetrated the thick darkness of the woods, but I could see something. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was him, or at least, it looked like him. He stood there, half in shadow, wearing the same clothes I remembered him in all those years ago. His face was partially obscured, but there was something wrong about the way he stood. Something unnatural. My throat tightened as he raised his hand, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't stop myself from stepping into the forest, following him. I called his name, my voice barely above a whisper, and he turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder. His face was pale, and his eyes looked hollow, as if the light had gone out behind them. He didn't say anything, just gestured for me to keep following. The deeper we went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like gnarled hands. I realized, too late, that the sounds of the campfire had faded completely. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps anymore. The only sound was his voice, calling me further into the dark. We reached a clearing, and that's when he stopped. His back was to me, but I could see his shoulders rise and fall, as if he were breathing hard. I took a cautious step forward and called out to him again. That's when he spoke, his voice low and urgent, almost a hiss. "Turn around," he said. Something in his tone sent a jolt of fear through me. I froze, my skin crawling. The urge to turn around was overwhelming, but at the same time, something inside me screamed not to. I stood there, heart hammering, torn between the instinct to flee and the terrifying curiosity of what might be behind me. "Turn around," he repeated, more forcefully this time. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, I turned. The tent was gone. The campfire was gone. Everything, the car, the familiar sights of the camp had vanished. All that remained was the forest, dark and endless, stretching out in every direction. Panic surged through me. I whipped back around to where my friend had been standing, but the clearing was empty. He was gone, just as he had been all those years ago. My breath came in ragged gasps as I frantically searched the woods, my flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. Nothing, no sign of him. No sign of anything. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Where was I? What had just happened? My hand flew to my pocket, searching for my phone, but there was no signal. The world felt wrong, as if I had stepped into a place that didn't belong to me, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. I had to get out. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was away from here. My legs were shaking as I started running, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the branches scratching at my skin or the roots tripping me up. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the forest and into the clearing where I had parked my car. My heart nearly exploded with relief when I saw it still sitting there, and touched, waiting for me. I yanked the door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut behind me. Fumbling with the keys, I started the engine and floored the gas. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, the trees blurring past me. I just needed to get away, as far away as possible. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I dared glance in the rearview mirror. What I saw nearly made me swerve off the road. Sitting in the back seat, grinning with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, was my friend. The same friend who had disappeared all those years ago. His voice echoed in my ears, soft and familiar, as he whispered one last thing. "You should have stayed," I screamed. My hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and when I glanced back again, he was gone. The car was empty, just as it had been when I left the forest. But the feeling of being watched, of something dark and ancient following me, never left. I didn't stop driving until I was far from that place, and I've never gone back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear his voice, whispering, calling, and I know, deep down, that he's still waiting for me to return. I don't know why we thought it was a good idea to go camping in late autumn. Maybe we were drawn to the idea of escaping the routines of everyday life, or maybe it was the allure of an isolated getaway. Either way, I found myself sitting by a fire in the middle of the woods with 3 friends, the temperature steadily dropping as the night crept in. The campfire crackled, sending sparks into the cold night air. Our tents were set up just beyond the light of the fire, the edges of the forest closing in on us like dark walls. The leaves had already fallen, so the bare trees stretched out like skeletal hands in every direction. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the forest were holding its breath. We had been hiking all day, and after dinner, we were telling stories around the fire. It was the usual banter, mostly jokes and exaggerated tales of childhood. But after a while, the stories turned darker. Andy, always the showman, started sharing creepy folklore. It was nothing we hadn't heard before, stories of haunted woods and strange creatures lurking just beyond the safety of the firelight. But something about the way he spoke that night made the atmosphere shift. As Andy finished one of his stories about a local legend, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was the kind of sensation that creeps up on you slowly, starting at the base of your spine before crawling its way up to the back of your neck. I turned to look into the woods, shining my flashlight between the trees, but there was nothing. Just the wind rustling through the branches, the occasional snap of a twig. "You ever feel like something's out there watching?" I said, half joking but feeling uneasy. "It's just the woods playing tricks on you," Andy replied. "Your mind tries to fill in the gaps when it's this dark." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I poked the fire, sending a few embers up into the air, trying to distract myself. The conversation shifted again, and for a while, I managed to push the feeling aside. But then, we all heard it, a low, guttural growl from the edge of the woods. Everyone froze. "Did you guys hear that?" asked Dan, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded, staring into the dark. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but blackness. The growl came again, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't a normal animal sound. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It was deeper, almost wrong. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, we saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the light from deep within the woods. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever seen. Whatever it was huge. "That's not a wolf," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The eyes disappeared, but we could hear movement, heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves, coming closer. None of us moved. We just stared in the direction of the noise, paralyzed by fear. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. "It's circling us," Andy said, his voice tight. The growling came again, this time from the opposite side of the camp. We whipped our heads around, shining our flashlights into the darkness, but again, we saw nothing. It was playing with us, moving around us, staying just out of sight. "We need to go back to the tents," I whispered. Now. We quickly doused the fire with dirt, the flames sputtering out, plunging us into almost complete darkness except for the narrow beams of our flashlights. Moving as quietly as we could, We started walking back toward the tents, huddling together. The footsteps followed us, keeping pace, always just beyond the range of the light. As we reached the tents, the growl came again, much louder this time. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the sound, and there it was. It looked like a wolf, but it wasn't. It was much, much larger, with long, matted fur and limbs that seemed to long for its body. Its eyes were glowing with an unnatural light, and its mouth hung open in a twisted snarl, revealing rows of sharp teeth. It stood on all fours, but its back was arched in a way that looked almost human, as if it were too big for its own skin. For a second, I thought I was going to pass out from fear. None of us moved. It just stood there, staring at us, growling low and deep, its eyes never leaving ours. Then, slowly, it began to move forward. "Run!" I shouted, breaking the silence. We bolted for the car, our feet slipping on the leaves and rocks as we scrambled down the path. I could hear the creature behind us, crashing through the underbrush, its growls growing louder and more frantic. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting to the car, getting out of those woods. We reached the car and piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature burst out of the trees. It stood there, just outside the circle of the headlights, pacing back and forth, growling, its eyes locked on us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. As the car roared to life, the creature let out a deafening howl, a sound so unnatural and otherworldly that it sent a shiver down my spine. We tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road, the creature chasing us for a few terrifying moments before disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the lights of the highway finally coming into view. Only then did we start to breathe again, the adrenaline slowly fading. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. No one had an answer. We just sat there, silent, staring out the windows, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But here's the thing. As we drove away from the forest, something strange happened. I glanced in the rearview mirror, just to make sure the creature wasn't following us, and for a split second, I saw something. Not the creature, a figure, a man, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. He was tall, with long stringy hair, and his clothes were tattered and dirty. He was standing perfectly still, just staring at the car as we drove away. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to freak them out more than they already were. But that image has stayed with me, burned into my mind. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was some kind of animal or something else, something worse. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go camping in those woods again, and I'll never forget the eyes watching us as we left. We have been coming to this camp every summer for as long as I could remember. It was our family tradition, a week of unplugging, hiking, swimming in the lake, and roasting marshmallows over the fire. The campgrounds were tucked away deep in the forest, secluded from the bustle of civilization. It was always peaceful, and I looked forward to it all year. But this year was different. When we arrived, the first thing we noticed was the sign at the entrance had changed. The camp had a new name, and it wasn't subtle. The old wooden sign that used to read Camp Whispering Pines was replaced by a crude, hand-painted one. The letters were smeared with what looked like red paint, and it read "No welcome here." I thought it was a joke, or maybe a prank by the new owner, who had taken over the camp recently. Still, it was unsettling. My parents shrugged it off, too excited to let something like that ruin the trip. We checked in, greeted by a man who barely said a word. He was tall, with a gaunt face and eyes that didn't quite meet ours when we spoke. His smile was tight, almost forced, as he handed us our keys and told us our usual cabin was ready. The woods around the camp seemed quieter than usual. The trees loomed overhead, and there was an oppressive silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The first day went by without incident. We spent the day at the lake, swimming and sunbathing, and by nightfall, we were gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories, just like always. But that night, as the fire began to die down and the air grew colder, something felt off. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that made them sound like whispers. That's when we first noticed the signs. My brother, Eric, was the one who saw it first. He had wandered a little way from the fire to grab something from one of the tents. He called out, his voice tight with confusion. We all turned to see what he was pointing at. Just beyond the edge of our campsite, etched into the dirt, was a strange symbol, a circle with jagged lines running through it, like some kind of rune. None of us had ever seen anything like it. At first, we thought it was some kind of prank. Maybe kids from another campsite messing with us. But when we checked the surrounding area, there were no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been there. As the night wore on, more symbols began to appear. They were scattered around the perimeter of our campsite, crudely scratched into the ground, as if something had dragged its claws through the dirt. It didn't make any sense. We were miles from the nearest town, and as far as we knew, we were the only ones staying in that section of the camp. My dad tried to brush it off, saying it was probably some kind of weird wildlife marking its territory, but even he didn't sound convinced. The air was thick with tension, and none of us could shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond the trees. Then we found the note. It was early the next morning, just after sunrise. My sister, Emily, was the one who spotted it, taped to the front of her tent. It was an old piece of paper, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was jagged and frantic. The message was simple: leave this place. A chill ran down my spine as we gathered around to read it. My dad tried to laugh it off again, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. He wanted to believe it was a prank, that someone was just trying to scare us. But the fear in his eyes told a different story. We decided to leave. Whatever was going on, it wasn't worth sticking around to find out. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, trying to keep calm, but the sense of unease was palpable. Every time I glanced into the trees, I half expected to see someone or something lurking just beyond the tree line. As we loaded the car and began driving down the dirt road that led out of the camp, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees were denser here, the branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The road twisted and turned, and with every mile, the feeling of dread grew stronger. Then we saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, about 50 feet ahead, was a figure. It was draped in a long, tattered cloak that fluttered in the wind, the hood pulled low over its face, obscuring its features. In one hand, it clutched a long, rusted sickle, the blade catching the light as it swung gently by its side. My dad slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. We all sat there, frozen, staring at the figure as it stood motionless in the road. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The air was thick with fear, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Then, slowly, the figure began to move. It took a step forward, the sickle dragging along the ground behind it with a metallic scrape. Another step, then another. My heart was pounding in my chest as the figure drew closer. My dad threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning in the dirt as we backed away. But the figure didn't stop. It kept moving, its pace steady and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. We were backing up so fast that we almost ran off the road, the wheels skidding dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop-off. My dad cursed under his breath, trying to keep the car steady, but it didn't matter. The figure was getting closer. Just when I thought we were going to be trapped, it stopped. The figure stood there, no more than 20 feet from the car, the sickle hanging limply at its side. For a moment, everything was still. Then it raised its head. I'll never forget what I saw when that hood slipped back. It wasn't a face, not a human one, at least. The skin was pale and stretched tight over the bones, the eyes black and hollow, like pits. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, filled with jagged, yellow teeth. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified me the most. It was what I saw beyond it. In the trees, barely visible in the shadows, were more figures. Dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their hands clutching sickles identical to the one held by the figure in the road. We weren't alone. My dad gunned the engine, and we shot backward, turning the car around and speeding down the road as fast as we could. The figures didn't chase us, but I could feel their eyes on us, watching as we fled. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away. The camp nothing more than a distant memory. None of us spoke for a long time. The silence in the car was suffocating, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us. When we finally reached the safety of civilization, we told ourselves we would never speak of it again. It was too strange, too impossible, but I can't stop thinking about it. The next day, we reported the incident to the local authorities, but when they went to investigate, the camp was deserted. No signs of anyone living there, no strange symbols in the dirt, no cloaked figures. It was as if the camp had vanished. But here's the thing. A few weeks after we returned home, I found something strange in my backpack. Tucked into one of the side pockets was a piece of yellowed paper, crumpled and worn. It had the same jagged handwriting as the note we found at the campsite. It said, "You can never leave." I threw the paper away. But sometimes, When I close my eyes at night, I see that figure standing in the road, its sickle glinting in the light, its grin fixed on me. I know, deep down, that this isn't over. The camp may be gone, but something followed us home. And it's only a matter of time before it comes back.